of New England Newspaper and Press Association, and we are thrilled to have you join us today for Solidarity Journalism. Um, we are going to talk about reporting for social justice beyond taking sides. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. You can leave your cameras on if you want. We would like a little bit of interaction, so Anita's going to ask a couple of questions in the beginning, but if you have questions, you can either put them in the chat or we'll open it up for questions at the end. But please keep your microphones muted. If you forget and you turn it on, we'll probably turn it off for you. Today, we will be recording the webinar, so you will have access to it afterwards. We'll probably get it sent out to everybody tomorrow, so look for an email tomorrow. And tomorrow we do have another webinar. If you haven't seen it on Google Analytics, if it's your area and you're interested in it, you can still register for that. So I'd like to thank Dr. Anita Varma for joining us today. Anita leads the Solidarity Journalism Initiative. She's an assistant professor at the School of Journalism and Media at University of Texas, Austin, where she focuses on media ethics. She's also a senior faculty research associate at the Center for Media Engagement. Dr. Varma's research, teaching, and public engagement all focus on the role of solidarity in journalism. She's on the board of SPJ for their Northern California chapter, the advisory board of the Objectives, and previously she served as chair of the Media Ethics Division of the Association for Education and Journalism and Mass Communications. Prior to UT Austin, she was the Assistant Director of Journalism and Media Ethics at the Markula Center for Applied Ethics at Santa Clara University, where she started the Solidarity Journalism Initiative. And I just learned today that she used to live here in Boston as well. Anita, thank you so much, and I'm going to hand it over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Linda. And thank you, Tara. I am so delighted to be here. And I must acknowledge that I have not been the best at responding to emails. Some of you might relate to that in 2025. So I really want to appreciate all of Tara's efforts to bring us together today. I also realized as we were starting, I was starting to get emotional for a few reasons that I'll share with you and for anyone who's watching the recording, which is that a year ago, I was attacked for the work that I'm about to share with you. And these attacks started in 2021, grew larger in 2023 online. If you search my name, you'll probably see some of these false claims and allegations against me, none of which are true. They spread and infiltrated my personal life. And this time last year, I had to leave my own home because I was no longer safe there. UT police were very emphatic that these attacks were not likely to stop just because I chose not to respond. And that creates a context for this work that I think makes it all the more important and all the more challenging to have conversations that use words like solidarity, social justice, and journalism in these times. I have not ever given up on this work, largely because journalists have asked me to continue. But since those attacks, I have taken to prefacing any public comments I make about my work with this, to say that I think everyone who's a journalist or simply a critical thinker will agree that we all need to think for ourselves. And so I'm going to present my work and the approaches that are grounded in what real reporters do to use this approach called solidarity already. And I encourage you to decide what of this has merit, what of this does not, and what you might use or not use. But the biggest allegation that frustrates me is this claim that I have a framework for journalism that I think should end the conversation about journalism. That has never been the case. But I do articulate a framework that I think is really important in these times. So that's what I'll spend the first time, part of our time doing today, and then we'll have time for questions as well. So let me share some slides to frame our discussion, and then we'll do a quick interactive bit, as Linda mentioned, and then we'll get into the crux of our content. All right. Is everyone able to see my screen? Yes, fantastic. The hardest part is over. So this is the first sentence of my book, which is coming out in March. The first sentence is just 2 words. I try to do journalists proud. Academics are well known to use too many words when we could use fewer. It only took me 11 years to write this 2-word sentence, which is truth matters. I think truth absolutely matters. And this is also partly a response to the allegations against my work that claim incorrectly that I am unconcerned with truth. That couldn't be farther from the actual reality of the work that follows. So here's a shameless plug for my book that will be published with Columbia University Press. It's called Solidarity in Journalism: How Ethical Reporting Fights for Social Justice. And this is based on 10 years of research that I've done that has primarily been a matter of talking to journalists. I've interviewed journalists, I've done workshops with journalists, I've done closed door sessions, open door sessions, every type of convening that a person could do, including during the COVID-19 pandemic. I did it. And that was also including one-on-one consultations, as well as more formal settings like this one, where there are workshops and more of a discussion based on slides. But what is always remarkable to me about journalists is the extent and the persistence that they will go to ensure that their reporting is truthful. And I think all too often journalists are getting maligned or misunderstood based on this notion that journalists are interested in their own self-interest rather than the public interest. So that's what brings me to this word solidarity. I argue in the book and throughout all of my work that journalism at its ethical best is a tremendously important act of solidarity with the public. When journalists are accused of being in support or solidarity with billionaires or with their own pocketbooks or with some selfish aims of strategic interests, I tend to roll my eyes because I've yet to meet a journalist who is doing the true hard work of journalism and is somehow out for themselves. By and large, I see journalists who are in it for the public. And so that's what I mean when I say the word solidarity, being in support of something larger than our own personal interest. But I'm very curious, when you hear the word solidarity, and clearly you signed up for this workshop, hopefully knowing that's what it was called, what words come to mind? And if I can find the chat, I'm hoping I can ask you all to drop some words in the chat that come up for you. We've got understanding, excellent. Unity, yes. Inclusivity, compassion, and justice, for sure. Community, one of my favorite words. Any other words that come up for you? These are all phenomenal. Nayla called out the word that I often include that rarely comes up in these word associations: together, absolutely, which is justice. And specifically, the type of justice that I focus on that journalists are often most concerned about is a social sense of justice. So we do see journalists who might cover or amplify an idea of a different way of distributing wealth, but social justice tends to be where journalists emphasize and show concern for the most vulnerable members of our communities. So that brings me to our plan for today. So I'm going to start by sharing just a little bit about what solidarity means and what it could possibly have to do with journalism. And then we'll consider what I think is a really important aspect to incorporate in our discussion, which is that journalism and society are facing many crises, plural. So how might solidarity journalism help to meet this current moment? And then we'll have plenty of time for your questions. And I know we'll finish at the hour. So as Linda mentioned, I was part of the Society for Professional Journalists Northern California chapter. I actually just recently left the board because I have too many board commitments now. But it was a phenomenal 5 years I spent with SPJ. And I teach the SPJ Code of Ethics in all of my classes. And I think the way that the SPJ Code starts is really important. They say, seek truth and report it. And my question is, how? So we see 3 primary ways that journalists across the US, this includes local, metro, statewide, national, even international journalists, will report in ways that they view as aligned with seeking truth and reporting it. So first and foremost is seeking truth in the podium. So if the White House press secretary, if the mayor or governor of a place is giving a press conference, we might see journalists go there. They're not going there necessarily because they like the person at the podium. They may have absolutely negative personal views of the person at the podium, but there's a notion that if there's someone with a podium, if there's someone in a position of power and they're speaking, that could be a source of truth, right? And that to serve the public, we might even think that journalists should be there to monitor what people with official power are saying and doing. A different way of seeking truth is more of a civic approach, where journalists might say, well, we are not going to focus on the podium. We want to know what's happening to most people in a place. What's happening to most people in Boston right now? What's happening to most people in the United States right now? What's happening to most people in the world right now? And that's a different lens of saying we're going to seek truth in the majority. So what are average people going through? Let's report that. That's the truth of what they're going through. It may or may not be the focus of someone with a podium. So let's go to the people and let's go to most of them to say, well, lots of people are going through this, so it matters. This last column is where I focus and where I get into lots of good trouble, which is seeking truth in solidarity. That's where journalists are looking to represent people who are struggling to survive. Now, you may have guessed based on my name, based on how I physically present, that my family is from India. I was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But in India right now, the vast majority of the world's largest population is facing a struggle to breathe. Air quality in India is breaking records right now. And so in that situation, you would see people struggling to survive and average citizens experiencing the same issues, right? And that is unusual. In the US, we tend to see that people struggling to survive are very rarely of the majority, defined as the majority of people struggling to survive. So seeking truth and solidarity means that we're often looking to a minority of people, right? A lot of my work is about homelessness and housing instability. It's not the case that the majority of the United States or even the majority of any metropolitan region experience homelessness and housing insecurity. And yet, I want to suggest that in solidarity, we report those truths and do so from the ground up. So by and large, though, journalists, including in my very own journalism school here at UT Austin, are trained to go to the people with power. Go to the state capitol, go to the federal capitol, watch what people are doing and saying when they have power attached to them. They sit in seats of power, maybe they have PhDs and fancy titles, but they are positioned as authoritative in some way. Now, I hear lots of arguments in favor of this, particularly with everything that's happened at the Pentagon this year, to say that if journalists are not in the room, then it can make things very difficult for the public to know what's going on. But what I want to suggest is that even if journalists are in that room, there are many restrictions and contingencies of what kind of information they can make known from that room, even long before our current state of affairs. The main thing that focusing on corridors of power neglects is the reality of what's happening on the ground, often just beyond those corridors of power, right? So if you're only focusing on what the press secretary is saying, and that can be any press secretary or spokesperson, then we do not see journalism really have a way to account for what's happening, how people are protesting, how people are experiencing what people with podiums are claiming is happening and is not happening. At UT Austin, we see this all the time, that spokespeople for the university will absolutely make statements to the press, and many times the press will amplify those claims. But what about the protests that students are engaging in? What about the struggles that students are facing to afford housing in Austin, Texas? Those are often not accounted for by a spokesperson. Right? So we see a limited scope of truth that we get from the podium. So what is solidarity and what does all this have to do with journalism? Well, solidarity, as I define it, is a commitment to social justice that translates into action, a commitment to social justice that translates into action. And I really am emphatic about that action part, because all too often I hear with fair criticism that, solidarity is just lip service. Solidarity is just putting an emoji in your social media and moving on with your day. Maybe you sign a petition, but solidarity is meaningless. I think solidarity could be meaningless if that's all it is. But action means doing something out in the world. It means more than a personal, heartfelt belief, more than a private notion in your brain that you would never say. It means that you're actually out there doing it and showing yourself to be doing so. It's also not just a promise of future action. We hear lots of promises, lots of earnest pledges, but until those promises and pledges are actual action, then the action can't just be, I promise to do better. I promise to address gender inequities in wages, but to never do anything means that you fell short of solidarity, right? Social justice. This is the term that has made my work more controversial than I ever imagined it could be. I started all of this work in 2014, and lots of people told me this is not really advancing anything remarkable. Why don't you push farther? And it turns out even as far as I've pushed is too far, according to some people on the internet and offline. But social justice really means, as I use it and as I see journalists use it, dignity for everyone in a society. Dignity for everyone in a society. Based on not whether or not they are really nice people or really relatable people, but based instead on their inherent worth. You could be the very best person in your whole community. You could be the very worst person in your whole community, and you still, I want to suggest, as Kantian philosophers do, you have basic dignity. That dignity is not dependent on what you've done, what you will do, what you've achieved, what people say or don't say about you. It is inherent as a human being. So this is also where sometimes people get very angry and they say, no, you have forfeited the idea of merit. And I think merit is a very important thing to have in a society. But when we're talking about basic needs, these basic needs don't depend on our merit. So this is something I'll come back to in just a moment to explain why merit is not actually what solidarity reporting is seeking out to report. But I want to highlight that solidarity is a horizontal power dynamic. It's not about a top-down of finding someone who says, I will be in solidarity as long as it doesn't cost me anything, or I'll be in solidarity as long as it helps my tenure case and couldn't possibly hurt it. Instead, we say we have to operate on the same level as the people affected because we're not actually holier than thou or better than or somehow perched above the people. But what does dignity include concretely? How do we know if a community's basic dignity is at stake? And are we always so sure that they shouldn't just maybe work harder? Maybe that would help us. So the place that I locate dignity is at the level of basic needs, basic human needs, right? So these basic human needs I localize in something called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You might be familiar with this. This is also a controversial framework, but I think it puts in simple terms the place where I see journalists really focus their efforts. So to be clear, there are some journalism reform folks who say, I have a great idea for what journalists should do. And I think that's amazing. I have never had a great idea for what journalists should do. What I've done is look at what journalists already do. At their best, what is journalism doing and what is it for? Who are journalists really risking quite a lot to advance truthful narratives of? And what's the merit in what journalism does? A lot of my students tell me we have TikTok, we have Instagram, we have lots of places to get information. So why bother about journalism in particular? I think this is why. That at its very best, ethical journalism in the United States, as well as in other countries, has stood up when people's basic needs are at stake. That includes basic needs for air, water, food, shelter, personal safety. And these basic needs are not luxuries, right? So I think it's great to see when people can access luxuries, but until we have these basic needs met as a society, we can't yet jump to say, let's be more concerned about people's status than about their basic needs to survive. So social injustice comes about when people's basic needs are unmet due to conditions not of their own making, due to conditions not of their own making. I think if someone has made a series of horrible decisions that leads them to lack everything that they would need to survive, well, then they simply need to edit undo a lot of those decisions. But the biggest challenge is what happens when we are struggling not because of our own decisions, right? When we're struggling not because of our own decisions. This is something that in US society, there's tremendous denial of. There's a tendency to want to focus on the fact that, well, if you work really hard, you can make it too. But if that were true, why is it that a growing number of people in the United States who work full time are unable to afford housing? Unable to afford even the most modest housing in the places where they work. There are two reporters who are at the Washington Post, Abha Batare and Rachel Siegel, and they did reporting on people who had earned over $100,000 in 2022. And still, this is not just in major cities, but across middle America, could afford no housing whatsoever, not a rental, not anything even to downsize. So they moved into their cars. They were sleeping in their cars, which some of you may know, the Supreme Court has decided that local ordinances can make that an illegal activity. To sleep in your own car is permitted to be criminalized under Grants Pass if the state or the local ordinance chooses to. So I think this element of conditions not of their own making is really important. In a climate change context, a colleague of mine was talking about the fact that many people in Texas and elsewhere who are displaced because of climate change, it's not because they did something wrong. It's not because they chose the wrong place or the wrong state or the wrong livelihood. It's conditions that they themselves do not control. And that creates what we might call an ethical obligation. So journalists meet that ethical obligation all the time, and they do it through something that I call solidarity reporting, which is when that commitment to social justice translates into the action of reporting. So solidarity reporting will represent and prioritize, that means put at the top of the story, not at the bottom or as an afterthought, the firsthand knowledge of people affected. I would venture that those of you who are in New England know much more about New England than I do. I did live there 15 years ago. That does not mean that just because I have some fancy title or the microphone for now, that means I should be the one telling you the truth of the life that you live, right? And that's entirely the logic of solidarity reporting. Now, someone reporting in solidarity may have no personal preference. They might actually have some disdain for the people they're reporting on. And I'm always fascinated when people tell me, well, solidarity reporting, that only works if you've got a bunch of activists in the newsroom. But why doesn't that criticism hold for covering the White House? If we say that if you're covering people in a particular position that you're biased towards them, then why don't we say that about the White House press corps? Why don't we say that about people covering universities where they rely on spokespeople? Many times reporters are covering those issues to seek truth. They're not covering them because they personally endorse everything they're saying. So solidarity reporting follows that same logic and moves away from this notion of just quoting people affected for their emotions. So very often we see reporting that will focus on the sob story, or they'll focus on the story of triumph. They might focus on the story of resilience. That is strictly an emotional context. And that emotional context may actually neglect a lot of the truth of what's going on. So instead, solidarity reporting will, it can account for emotions, but it primarily focuses on what is the truth of what's happening. And the truth of what's happening to any of us at any given moment is never strictly a matter of emotions. I'm always waiting for the day when the governor will give a press conference, and the only question a reporter has is, and how do you feel about that, sir? But for some reason, when it comes to people impacted by issues like an affordability crisis, the only question that sometimes reporters are asking is, how do you feel about that? When in fact, in solidarity reporting, people are given a chance to speak about not just how they feel, but what it is that they're going through. Also want to highlight that solidarity reporting, and I've studied this by hand, I would not entrust ChatGPT to do my work for me. Solidarity reporting actually includes more and different types of sources than reporting that strictly focuses on officials with the podium. So by that, I mean solidarity reporting will start with people affected, but then we will hear from officials, elites, outsiders. It's just that they're not steering the ship. Why? Because they don't know what people impacted do know. So solidarity reporting means starting with people living the issue and representing them as the experts on the issues affecting their own lives. I am deeply exhausted of seeing national discourse on what is happening to higher education in Texas that ignores anyone working in higher education in Texas, right? To the same extent that would seem really laughable to say, I'm going to write a story about the mayor and not include the mayor. I think we need to apply that same logic as journalists do when they prioritize marginalized people's definitions of their own ongoing struggles. This may indeed challenge the definitions that people are using when they rely solely on the podium. So the podium has led to some really problematic definitions of what it means to have AIDS, what it means to be poor, what it means to be a woman. And I think we need to hear from people impacted by these issues and many more in order to seek that truth and report it. But does solidarity mean that journalists are going to join and affirm social movements? This is a very common question I get, so common that I put it on a slide. And generally, when people ask this question, there's a subtext to it that is, I don't know if this is such a good idea. Are we really willing to say that journalists should no longer even strive to be objective, that they should no longer attempt to remain neutral and impartial? And what might that mean when social movements collide? So I answer this question in two ways. One is with the fact that social movements tend to have their own journalism. And that's true of every social movement in documented modern history for a very funny reason, which maybe I'm too online to have realized this. But the very simple reason that social movements create their own journalism is that before the internet, before mass media access, social movements needed a way to spread their message that was not restricted to people who could physically be there. So how did they do that? They created their own magazines, their own pamphlets, their own newspapers. And so that is often a form of solidarity reporting. The labor press, for example, it's in the name. That was not a violation of their ethics. They were part of the labor movement. They were advancing the labor movement. And many times their reporting on the labor movement was more accurate than supposedly independent journalism, which often stood against the interests of the labor movement. So that type of solidarity reporting does exist. But this is the type of solidarity reporting that I focus on much more so because I think it's under represented and less well understood. But it happens in all different types of news outlets. So it happens in the most mainstream news outlet you can think of. It happens in the most niche news outlet you can think of, but it doesn't happen often enough, I want to suggest. So this is where solidarity takes the form not necessarily of the journalist joining up with a movement, but of the journalist moving from the podium to the people. Notice that the journalist is still standing apart. It's not requisite that the journalist be among the people affected. It's also not requisite that the journalist be particularly fond of the people affected, but only that the journalist brings together in the story multiple people affected by an issue that places their basic needs at stake. And that plural of people is really important because a common criticism of this type of approach is when people misunderstand it to mean that I'm suggesting we get a poster child, get a token source to say, okay, here's a human face, now moving on to the podium people. But that's not yet solidarity reporting. Solidarity reporting will demonstrate, as examples on the site that I have do, that this issue doesn't just affect one or two unlucky individuals. It's not like being struck by lightning where you were in the wrong place at the wrong time, but instead that it's a systematic issue, that the systematic dimension doesn't come from some academic diagnosing it as such, but it comes from the fact that people are experiencing the same issue with remarkable consistency. It would be a wild coincidence if all of these people struggling to stay housed are somehow all uniquely affected by bad luck, right? That's not what's going on. The reality is housing affordability. How do we know that? Because people know that the reality is housing affordability. Now, many people in elected power don't want to acknowledge that, or they want to acknowledge it in a certain way to blame the other guy for it. But when we hear from the people impacted, that can have tremendous value in terms of the truth value of a story. So how do journalists do that? What do they actually do? Well, as I mentioned, they will move their focus, their emphasis, and their starting point from the podium to the people. So if we start with the podium, then it's very likely that many of these issues placing people's basic survival, their basic dignity at stake, will never be acknowledged. There are very few officials who really want to acknowledge people's struggles to survive when it's not an election year. And I say that with bipartisan criticism. So, on the two major parties, they both suddenly discover affordability crises when it's time to be elected. But otherwise, where is the emphasis? Well, it's on how well the stock market is doing. But we know that the stock market is not a reliable indicator of how people are doing who struggle for their basic needs. So, in solidarity reporting, journalists move to talk to the people affected, which means they seek them out. So, here's the 6 steps that I lay out in my book of how journalists do this. As I mentioned, I've talked to hundreds of journalists in the past 11 years now, but the book really focuses on 35 of them where I did systematic interviews and analyzed hundreds of stories using this approach in both San Francisco and Austin, as well as national reporting. And by the way, these approaches are remarkably consistent across newsrooms that have 2 full-time reporters and newsrooms that have 200 full-time reporters. Sometimes people ask, well, do I need a special grant? Do I need special time? Reporters who do this have told me that they actually find it faster than trying to get a podium person to respond to them. So we can make of that what we will. But the first step of reporting in solidarity means deciding what's newsworthy. So I have all the respect in the world for Taylor Swift, but if you're doing a solidarity story, it's unlikely that she's the starting point, right? And I say that only half in jest. Sometimes we do see stories where if a celebrity acknowledges an issue of people struggling for their basic dignity, then it's a story. But until that happens, it's somehow not a story. So solidarity reporting would say, oh, it's a story when people's basic dignity is at stake. Second step is seeking out sources. The biggest question is, where do I find people affected? Keeping in mind that most journalists are not necessarily struggling for their basic needs. So if they're trying to cover these issues, where do they find people? It's not necessarily going to be in their immediate surroundings. But what journalists have told me they do boils down to 3 practices: going there, being there, and going back. So going to the places where people are living in low-income housing and are being evicted due to mold. Being there means staying for longer than a quick soundbite, but actually to look around, to try to understand, to talk to multiple people. And this last step of going back, I continue to find this to be the most fascinating and unexpected part of my research, but journalists who were actually reporting in very time-constrained circumstances, including TV reporters, told me that they would do this. They would go there, they would be there, and they would go back. Going back, meaning they would go back to marginalized people to show them the story and to ask them for feedback, not just on, well, what else should I cover, but to hear from them what they thought of how the story was told. And I asked a TV reporter, how did you get the idea for that? She reacted to me as if I was some kind of strange person for asking, because to her it was very intuitive. She said it wasn't an idea, it was just humanity. If I'm telling someone else's story, they're going through all of this, then it can't be that I just am glad if the governor watches it and sends me a message. It has to be that they have a chance to see it. And physically going back to the place went a long way in trust building and in making it clear that this is not just a one and done story. So that's with the sourcing element. With interview questions, journalists would not just ask, how do you feel about that? In some cases, journalists recognize that that could be a really offensive question. If you have someone who has nowhere to sleep tonight and you ask them, how do you feel? Well, it's not going to be good. But instead, they would ask, what's happening here? What do you think? And what do you need? I think that question of what is it that you need was one of the most common and most revealing, where people would say, what I need is to not be ticketed if I sleep in my car tonight because the emergency shelters are full. I have nowhere else to go. My sister's landlord kicked me out, and so I can't stay with family anymore. I just need to be able to get to work in the morning to get on my feet again. And as we see lots of discourse about restricting people from parking overnight, for example, what's called camping in vehicles, I think a lot of times that coverage focuses on the majority of people, which are residents of an area, but not on who is sleeping in these cars and why. Quote selection in solidarity stories will represent the perspectives of people directly affected, not the most controversial quote that we hear. So if you talk to 12 people and ask them the same question, chances are at least one of them will say something very controversial, very salacious, very sensationalizable. But with solidarity reporting, the goal is not to present the outlier. The goal is to present what are people going through and what quotes are representative of that. I also have a lot of respect for journalists who use this approach to reporting and have told me that they thought the story was something different. So there are journalists who cover affordability in Austin, and they might think that it's an issue for students because of tuition, but when they actually talked to students, they said, no, the issue is housing. And so they actually changed the story, right? Rather than saying, well, let me find the one person who said something aligned with the idea of the story I had, they changed the story altogether, which I also think is an act of ethical reporting. When narrating a story, reporting in solidarity means asking this question, whose definitions are you adopting? If you are adopting the Federal Reserve's definition of economic growth to not illuminate or to ignore reports of people struggling for basic needs, that's a decision. If you're adopting people's struggles to pay for groceries as well as for their healthcare and for their rent, that's also a decision. But I think asking that question is something that reporters who are doing this work will ask on a continual basis. Last but not least comes to assessing impact. I am here to regretfully tell you that solidarity stories don't go viral. I'm sure our analytics speaker tomorrow may have more to say about virality. These stories don't go viral. They're not likely to go viral. I read all kinds of solidarity stories. I've yet to see one go viral. And the virality conversation has much more to do with what social media platforms will algorithmically prioritize rather than an indication of value on its own. But I think the ethical value is very clear that solidarity stories dating back to the 1800s refuse to normalize inhumane conditions. Refuse to normalize inhumane conditions. Now, that is not necessarily something that we can see on a metrics dashboard. That's not necessarily something that we can see as impactful tomorrow. But I think it's the most important reason that we do need journalism, and we really need ethical journalism that goes to the people affected to resist this urge that we see collectively rising among people with power to say, well, some people just don't have what it takes to survive. If that were true, that'd be one thing. But again, we see far too many people struggling to survive to make it justifiable to normalize it. But isn't all of this biased? Absolutely. There are tremendous biases in any type of journalism, and solidarity journalism is no different. But let me suggest that solidarity journalism is biased in favor of truth. Just because someone with tremendous power says that University of Texas at Austin is an institution that has forfeited education in favor of advocacy does not make it true. We would need to hear from the people being educated or not there to hear what the truth is. We would need journalists to come and see what the truth is. We see this in accounts of Portland and Charlotte and Chicago. Just because someone with a podium says these cities are places where there is no law and order, well, let's go talk to the people affected there about whether there is law and order there. And that is a bias. That means that you are not creating an equivalence between someone saying things that are untrue based on what's happening on the ground versus people who are on the ground and what you're seeing with your own eyes. I think these are biases that journalism desperately needs. Solidarity journalism is also biased in favor of basic dignity. And it's never not confusing to me that that's controversial, but absolutely, it is a bias towards saying we need to focus on the most vulnerable people in our society, not on the least vulnerable people, which is actually the bias that we see in lots of for-profit journalism that focuses on billionaires, right? That's a bias too, to say whatever Elon Musk does means that he's newsworthy because he lives in Austin, as opposed to all the other people who live in Austin who are in no way, shape, or form represented by what Elon Musk is going through at a given moment. So a bias towards Elon Musk is a bias towards influence, and a bias towards basic dignity is a bias towards social justice. And finally, solidarity journalism is indeed biased in the public interest. Private companies, parent companies may not be such a fan of this type of reporting. Why? Because it doesn't go viral. It doesn't necessarily sell big. It doesn't necessarily help their bottom line to sell more things if we are encouraging people to consider ramifications of some of those things. And yet, this is what journalism is for. Right? I think that many functions of journalism can and are being replaced by other forms of media, but solidarity journalism is one that we do not yet have a bot that can really do it. Solidarity journalism is not, however, a matter of partisan bias. And what's very funny to me about accusations that I am some kind of partisan advocate is that I actually criticize both political parties. I mentioned that I've lived in California, now Texas, and both political parties have neglected the reality of homelessness for generations. So there's nothing partisan about speaking to people impacted by crises and struggles like homelessness. The bias is to prioritize people impacted. We see this happening with the discussion of the Epstein files, where the press conference that survivors gave, some of them noted, they said it shouldn't matter, but I'll say it, one of them said, I voted for Donald Trump and I want these files released, right? That is an example of focusing on the people impacted, not on the partisan axes, which, by the way, are often changing as well. So last but not least, before we open for questions, let me talk about this notion of meeting our current moment. How does solidarity journalism help meet the current moment? Well, I do think now, as ever, truth really matters. The public desperately needs journalism that reports what is actually happening on the ground in real time to real people, not what officials and experts may prefer to claim is happening or speculate could happen or kind of predict and conclude from afar is most likely happening. Chicago and Charlotte are two salient examples of this, where the conditions, particularly for children, are becoming cause for concern, as well as for journalists who are facing attacks for doing nothing more than recording on a public street. So the stakes of truthful reporting are highest for people subjected to conditions that deny their basic dignity. And that's why solidarity journalism starts with the people who are subjected to those conditions. And I think that that type of bias is quite fruitful in order to understand what is happening. If you ask me what is happening in Boston today, I have an extensive number of degrees after my name. That doesn't mean I know what's happening in Boston today. And so I think this notion of a hierarchy of knowledge also needs to be reconsidered as we think about our current moment. Oftentimes, the people who are most adversely affected are not people who get to have a podium, and yet that's where we need journalism to provide more. So here are a few questions to keep in mind as you consider this reporting approach. First is, who comes first in your piece? Who comes first? Who comes last? Who doesn't come at all? And whose definitions are steering what the story uses as a frame? The second question is why? Why prioritize certain sources, certain definitions? I actually was speaking to a student this morning who's in another country, and I'm not quite sure why she wanted my thoughts on that country's climate change policy. But I have a guess it has to do with those letters after my name, much more than it has to do with any of my firsthand knowledge of the place, which is quite limited. And finally, to ask this question of how do your sources know what they claim to know? I think that this is crucial in all types of reporting, but in solidarity reporting, it becomes particularly important because, of course, there are people who would claim to speak on behalf of marginalized communities. And I think as journalists are well known for skepticism, there needs to be a healthy dose of skepticism to investigate if this person claims to be speaking on behalf of a group of people affected by an issue of marginalization. Does that align with what people affected are actually saying they need? Or is this person just claiming that they can speak on behalf of people that they're actually distanced from? So this question of how do your sources know what they claim to know? One way my students describe this is vibes. So if someone is making claims about what's happening in Austin, Texas based on vibes, I would strongly discourage journalists from leading with that, right? There is no verification there. Although oftentimes people will make vibes-based conclusions without any grounding in evidence or reality. And so asking that question, how do sources know what they claim to know? It also applies to marginalized sources. If marginalized sources have an explanation of what's going on, we also want to interrogate, okay, how do they know that? How do they come to that conclusion? But I think when we ask people, what are you living? We know how they know that. It's because they're the ones living it. So as I mentioned, we have this whole site. I dropped the link in the chat, and we have a wide range of examples that I'm always adding to that I encourage you to check out. I think you'll see that a very, very wide array of different types of news outlets are doing this approach. It's not just one cookie cutter set of check boxes. You'll see these stories are structured differently, but they all ultimately arrive at truth by reporting from the people impacted. And we have many more resources where that came from. These are all parts of my book, but these are designed for journalists to give convenient one-sheeters. I had journalists help me write these so they don't sound like an academic, and lots of journalists use these, also journalism training programs. I also just wanted to make a quick note about a new project that I just recently launched with a team of researchers called Dangerous Solidarity. So for years now, I've heard from journalists and media makers in all of the countries listed here that everything I've just told you has everything to do with their reporting, but that I've neglected a dimension of what to do when this type of reporting becomes dangerous. And for a long time, I thought, yeah, someone should study that. And it looks like it's going to be me and my team. So we have just started doing interviews with journalists, and we also include media makers, in part because of the lack of press freedom in some of these countries, where we're talking to journalists and media makers about how they do solidarity reporting, what makes it dangerous, and how do they continue anyway. And a big thing that we're hearing from some of the journalists so far is that very often journalists are concerned about their own safety, but more so they're concerned about their sources. So their marginalized sources may face genuine danger for speaking to a journalist on the record. Well, if solidarity reporting depends on hearing from the people impacted, how do journalists negotiate that? How do they navigate that? What's been really fascinating, and I'm just starting this study, is on journalists who then say, well, I'm not going to report this story because my sources could be killed for speaking to me on the record. And I think that is such a fascinating and important decision that some journalists make in order to, aim for that truth, but to recognize that sometimes the human costs may be too high. In other cases, journalists will find ways to persist, but I think we see this evolving context and climate in the US as well. I mentioned Chicago a few times. There are journalists there who have been physically attacked as well as detained. And I think the dangers attached to reporting in ways that go beyond what the podium folks would like us to see and hear and know is all the more crucial. So with that, I would welcome any of your questions. Let me stop my share.
I guess I'll start. I had written one in the chat. Did you do any research on how, if outlets do adopt more of this style of reporting, does it actually then make any inroads? You mentioned not going viral, but does it make inroads in audience growth for that media outlet potentially, where now they're embracing a segment of the community that they hadn't previously, and especially things like going back and showing them the story? So, is there evidence that at least it has that benefit for the outlets that engage?
Absolutely. So credibility, interestingly, a set of colleagues and I did a study of this, and we did look at it across partisan lines. And what we found was that credibility increases for Democrats. They become more likely to go back to that news outlet. And for Republicans, it stayed the same, which is really interesting. So Republicans tend not to trust what they view as mainstream news. And that did not change when you make it a solidarity story. And so, what my co author, Dr. Masulo, recommended is that if we see an environment where you could improve credibility among some of your audience and not adversely affect it among the rest, then this would actually offer a viable path forward. The next study that we're doing is actually using focus groups to understand more in the sense that cost of living affects everyone, right? And so I think that the challenge with the audience argument, though, is that many times news organizations that do have growing audiences still struggle to keep them. And that's not because of the value or lack of value of the reporting. That's often because of an oversaturated information ecosystem. But I think that solidarity reporting does intervene at the level of credibility, which can be important for both retention and even recognition that a news organization is genuinely doing news reporting. Thank you for that question. Jenny knows nothing about us without us. Yes, absolutely. I think this is really crucial, and disability activists have really led the way in a lot of ways of emphasizing that if you make decisions about, for example, building access without anyone who has a physical disability in the room, those decisions will not be good. Maybe you made those decisions with every good intention in your heart, and yet you can't really know what you don't know, right? And I think that that is such an important and practical illustration of how it can make a difference of where a ramp is placed, how steep is a ramp, how far is a ramp from rooms. That kind of practical level, I think, is really crucial. Jenny also notes we just did a story on SNAP recipients in which 3 out of 4 interviewees requested anonymity due to fear. I believe it. I am hearing more and more of that. 3 out of 4 is even less than some cases what I hear. And I myself, because of the safety concerns I've faced, I have started to either decline to speak on the record when it seems like something that could lead to further attacks on my safety, or I'll have lots of questions for journalists ahead of time. And that's as someone with high trust in journalists to start with. And Carolyn mentions we're seeing this with student reporting on campuses. Students are afraid to talk. Is it fellow journalists threatening or attacking you? So that depends on how you define journalist. I tend to consider journalists to be people who fact check. And so I would not consider these folks to be journalists, but they may self-describe as such. Carolyn asks, can you talk about the work you did that caused attacks on you, the nature of those attacks, and the reasons that people said they were against what you wrote? How did you address it? Thank you so much for this question. So the work that I actually did is what I just summarized for all of you. Now, what are people attacking? They are attacking a very different notion of that work than anything I've ever written or said. So where do I point to for that? Well, there were accusations that I am advocating something called race-based journalism. I myself do not know what race-based journalism is, so I can't possibly be advocating for such a thing. There is also a narrative that I am encouraging journalists to abandon truth in favor of ideology. I would actually argue that I'm calling for the opposite, and that, as I mentioned, this is not an approach that I'm originating. The earliest example of solidarity reporting is 1807 in America. I'm old, but not that old. And so these attacks are the outgrowth of what some call disinformation and what seems to be an extensive attempt to discredit my work, to claim that my research is not real research, that my teaching is not real teaching, and that I in no way have any connection to real journalists. None of those things are true, right? But what's fascinating in this information environment is that false claims do indeed travel quite virally in some cases. But the other attacks that I faced claim that I was a funded agent of George Soros. I have never received funding from George Soros, although Open Society Foundation gives lots of grants, just never to me. But this idea that I have been paid to say every single word that I just said to you and every single word that I wrote in my book, it's simply untrue. So to that extent, I would separate that from the actual work. And the main reason that I saw people, and this is not just from people who wrote this stuff, but from people who reshared it and commented on it, and I have a long list of things they said about me, that their main concern was that journalism cannot abandon truth, that truth really needs to be central. And interestingly, that's where my book starts, that truth does indeed matter. So, how did I address it? Well, I learned how to write a two-word sentence called Truth Matters. This is not about partisan ideology. This is not about any type of preferences on a personal level. This is about what's true. And I think journalism does need to be concerned about that. The other way I've addressed it is by changing some of the things that I do. So I used to do much more open public engagement where I would not necessarily know who was in the room. It didn't bother me. I think many journalists also feel that being in public means you won't always have an RSVP list, but that became unsafe for me. And so I do more convenings where I know who's in the room, and where, there's an ability to recognize if something is going wrong that needs to change. And I think the other piece that I've done and would very much welcome anyone's feedback that would like to be in touch after this, which I hope all of you might be, is this project called Dangerous Solidarity. So Dangerous Solidarity focuses on 15 countries, including the United States. And that is, I think, really important because oftentimes when we talk about dangers of doing journalism, in lots of journalism circles, there's a big emphasis on foreign places, places that are not like the US. But in the US as well, and by the way, the attack started in 2021, so this is not just a recent change, that we see these attacks and these dangers start to escalate. And there's remarkable consistency around the world. So that also is an outgrowth of the attacks that I faced and an attempt to find ways that people can persist. Question from Jenny about if Russia is among those countries. Russia would be a fascinating space to study. It is not on the list largely and quite simply due to my team's language acuity. And so we have bilingual and multilingual speakers who focus on the countries that I've just dropped in the chat, but we are looking to expand all of this. There are many countries that are not included in this list, and we want to account for all of them, actually. But we're starting with these 15. I realize we're just about at time. If anyone has one last question, I can be succinct. Oh, Mary notes, inspired by your courage. However, I'm puzzled by your choice of the word biased because of the implications of that word. Thank you so much for that. So this idea of bias in journalism is one that a good friend of mine, Dr. AJ Bauer at University of Alabama, is writing a book about. His book will also be out, I think, in the spring. It's called Making the Liberal Media. And he looks at the historical origins of this term bias and where these implications against having a bias in journalism came from. Interestingly, it came from progressive critics as well as conservative critics around the time of something called the Fairness Doctrine that were emphatic that there are problematic biases in journalism that needed to be regulated. And I think that the discourses around bias have continued to be strategic and oppositional and often strategically deployed. But ultimately, biases are unavoidable. I think that anyone who claims that I can rise above all biases is mistaken. We can rise above our personal biases, but there's no such thing as journalism that can make a decision about who to put first in a story that avoids a bias. If you choose to put the President of the United States as the first source in your story on affordability, that's a decision. If you choose to put people who have nowhere to sleep tonight and can't afford food as the first sources in your story, that's also a decision. So as soon as we have decisions, we are displaying our biases. I think that in many cases, journalists end up putting people first in their stories when their editor pressures them to. So it's not necessarily indicative of a personal bias, but I think that being biased towards the public interest and not strictly being biased in billionaire interests should be named and should be something that journalists own. And actually, in the context of awards, journalists are often celebrated for doing so, for displaying such a bias towards the most marginalized members of our society, not because they're better, but because they're the ones in need who we need to stand with. I realize I am a minute over time. Thank you all for being here, and I would welcome further conversation and discussion. I'm dropping my email in the chat. Thank you again.